Hello, MedTech Insight enthusiasts. This is Dr. Jennifer Joe with my co-host, the fabulous Dr. Ami Bhatt. She's streaming live from Mass General. So when Dr. Bhatt isn't here hosting the show, she's running the Massachusetts General Hospital telecardiology program, seeing congenital heart disease patients and teaching at the Harvard Medical School. When I'm not here hosting this show, I see patients in the emergency room, urgent care, and hospitalist setting. We're excited to have our digital health enthusiasts watching today. We also know we have a great audience of clinicians and clinician innovators. And today is just a really special topic that's near and dear to both of our hearts, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also how that impacts the peer review process in academic publishing. Ami, would you like to say more about that?
Yeah, so I think this is a peer review week. So in celebration of that, we really wanted to talk about academic publication, both diversity in academia in terms of who our authors are and ensuring that we're bringing everybody's work forward, but also talk a little bit about the research that we do and how we ensure that diversity is promoted. Our eventual goal is one of, rather than highlighting diversity and inclusion, making sure that it becomes a fabric of academia and the work that we do. And so that's what we're going to be talking to our guests about today. We are very lucky to have two very special guests. We have Dr. Wynn Williams, Deputy Editor of the New England Journal of Medicine with us. And we have Joe Pold, who's the Head of Marketing and Analytics at JMIR, and really a fan of open access publishing.
Wynn also trained me
about that. Oh, Wynn trained you,
back in the day.
A whole lot of others, but let's not date poor Wynn before he can get on the screen to defend himself.
I mean, I was just training like last year.
If you may have noticed, we came on a little bit early today, so we apologize to any of those who later on come in a few minutes late. We tried to identify that by social media, but Jen and I have the real pleasure of being on the center stage at Biomed Device Boston at 1:15 today. So start a little early, and then we're going to run cross town and see if we can make it over there to talk about kind of the future of what cardiac devices look like, the surgical suite, and how we're really going to put AI and digital health into the infrastructure of healthcare in the hospital. So that's exciting coming up later today. And finally, I know you guys have been hearing about this week after week. The book is in fact in print at the publisher. So our book on telemedicine and digital health will be out within the next few weeks for everybody. So maybe go ahead.
As a reminder, we love to interact and talk with our audience. So if you have questions, comments, please go ahead and start typing that in LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook. When you type it in, we can bring it up in the show. We can answer your questions. We just love to hear your name, where you're watching from, what you're interested, what you're passionate in, any questions that you may have for our audience. All shows are recorded and available after the fact on our website, Vanguard.Health/MedTech Insights. Be sure to keep up with the show by joining our mailing list. Look for us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And then, Ami, I think you were going to do some introductions.
Yeah. So just as a reminder to everybody, all the people on the show represent their own opinions and not that of any of the companies with they affiliate. And with that in mind, we'll first bring on Dr. Wynn Williams. So Dr. Williams is the Associate Chief of the Massachusetts General Hospital Division of Nephrology, and he's an Associate Professor of Medicine at the Harvard Medical School. He is, in fact, the founding director of the MGH Center for Diversity and Inclusion. He was named as deputy editor of the New England Journal of Medicine about 9 months ago. He is, in fact, the first African-American physician to be appointed to this position in the history of the journal. So we are very, very excited to bring him on. And on a personal note, he has been a mentor and a friend to both Dr. Joe and I. So it is a real honor. For those of you out there who have questions for him, please pepper him with questions about anything, but especially diversity and inclusion. Let us know about the efforts that you're doing. We would love to highlight those as well. And Jen, shall we start by bringing on Dr. Williams?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And I'm very excited to be here this morning with Dr. Joe and Dr. Bhatt and to speak on this issue of diversity and inclusion in peer review academic medicine. And I wanted to start by just saying why I think this topic is important. I think the impetus for this is a renewed effort in the aftermath of the racial reckoning over the past year and the broad public outcry after the murder of George Floyd to address systemic racism in society and medicine and so-called racialized medicine that may result in clinical constructs that do harm to communities of color. And I think this has been a very robust dialogue, certainly in major academic medical centers in the country and in publishing domains. I just want to focus on one of the conversations that has been, I think, again, very robust at the New England Journal of Medicine. And that's the idea that we published 2 weeks ago, looking at how we strive for diversity in research studies and how this academic medical publishing has a role in this. And so for years, just to begin, the New England Journal has published studies that simply do not include enough participants from the racial and ethnic groups that are disproportionately affected by the illnesses being studied to support any conclusions about their treatment. And in the United States, as you know, Black Americans are afflicted disproportionately by diabetes, hypertension, chronic kidney disease. Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans have other maladies, but these groups are frequently underrepresented in clinical trials and cohort studies. And there are a number of reasons, I think, for this, including simple logistical obstacles, whether transportation to clinical research centers is easily accessible and not cost prohibitive. But I think a major issue that prevents participants of color in trials is the fear and distrust of the medical establishment. And this harkens back to the well-worn example of the Tuskegee experiment, where African-American men, 400 African-American men in the 1930s who were infected with latent syphilis were allowed, unbeknownst to them and without informed consent, to have the natural history of syphilis play out in their lives. And this affected their spouses, offspring contracted congenital syphilis. And it was a severe and deep injustice to the Black community in this country. And it's been, I think, a bedrock of why ethnic minorities really fear and distrust organized medicine and experimentation, feeling that they are guinea pigs. I think another major contributor that we've been looking at is the dearth of investigators and study staff who themselves are members of minority groups who could outreach and engage patients, family, faith leaders, community members, and engender trust of the investigative apparatus that underserved communities might be leery of. And so we at the Journal have looked at this issue and want to be a part of the solution going forward to address why this is an important problem and why the way in which we approach publications in this domain should change. We feel that every funder should mandate appropriate representation, and clinical trialists should devise better methods of recruitment from traditionally underrepresented groups. And I certainly don't want to dominate the conversation here, but I would end with one point that I think is very important. So in the editorial that we published 2 weeks ago that you can find online, and it's entitled Striving for Diversity in Research Studies, as a medical journal, we realize we can't fix everything. But as of January 1st in the new year, we at the Journal will require, as a new step, that authors of research studies prepare a supplementary table that provides background information on disease, the problem, the condition under study, and the representativeness of the study group to be posted with the article at the time of publication online. And such a table would include, for example, in Dr. Bhatt's domain, for example, heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. And in that table, you'd have that disease category, and then special considerations related to sex and gender, age, race and ethnicity. And for example, heart failure with reduced ejection fraction disproportionately affects Black persons in the United States. And so the overall representativeness of the trial is also part of that table to have the investigators state how they've tried to include those patients in their cohort studies. So I think this requirement will foster greater thought and effort in the recruitment of of appropriate representation for participants in studies, and that this is a key initiative that should be a part of all trialists going forward who want to get their publications, their studies published.
Dr. Williams, this is fantastic. So first of all, for those who have not read this editorial, it doesn't really matter what field you're in. It is just a thought piece that is important about where we are in society today. So I would strongly encourage you to look that up and read it. Very thoughtful and applicable to more than just medicine. You know, we often talk about what can each institution do, and you've been there for 9 months, Dr. William, and you're doing it already. As of January 1st, it is not even a small, it is a big step towards really having people recognize the importance of the work that they're doing and recognize that there are areas where we have fallen down when it comes to being inclusive of racial and ethnic minorities, especially here in the United States. Some of the work that you had done leading up to this, a lot of it in the kind of kidney transplant world and kidney disease world, highlighted for many of us who may don't even, treat that disease, that there are certain subsets, and for me, in South Asians, that's cardiovascular disease, where a specific ethnicity or race is much more affected by a disease process and yet not represented in the trials. One of the ways you're getting at that is what you just discussed, but there's a lot of questions about what about the role of those companies that we are working with? What about the role of the large clinical trial organizations, throughout the country and the world? Where do we as investigators and how do we ask for help in terms of recruitment and getting these patient populations? Because as you said, there's so many different, I don't even like the word barriers. There's so many different challenges that we need to figure out how to deal with. They're not barriers. We just haven't figured out how to approach certain things yet. Any advice, because I see quite a few chiefs of departments on right now before they go off to their next meeting, any advice for academic leaders, academic clinicians in how do we go about addressing some of these things? What is it that we can specifically do the way you are at NEJM?
And we do just have some audience members before you move on. Dr. Borb is watching. She's an internal medicine physician, currently moving into industry. And she says, bravo to this new criteria. So thank you, Dr. Borb, for the feedback, and just so impressed with what Dr. Williams is doing. So Dr. Williams, to answer the question.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these questions have a lot of complexity to them, and they're multi-tiered complexities. So, and we look at structural racism in medicine. It happens at a system level in terms of how healthcare is organized and how well accessible healthcare is. It happens at the provider level, whether providers have the knowledge, the attitudes, the ability to communicate with vulnerable populations, whether in fact, as we say, they are culturally competent and have been trained as such. And then at the personal and the patient recipient level, there are demographic factors and maybe biology and genetic factors that are operant, and then in fact patient preferences, and that may be affected by, for example, what we said, social cultural values, some myths about organized medicine and so forth, and that all folds in to impact, I think, the processes and structure of care in terms of generating healthcare disparities. On the transplant example, as you mentioned, Ami, we know that, for example, African Americans occupy some 35% of the dialysis population in the country. That's disproportionate to their population distribution in the country of, say, 12.6, let's call it 13%. So a disproportionate burden of chronic kidney disease, end-stage renal disease. If you look at the best practices for kidney replacement therapy, we think that it constitutes kidney transplantation. But many studies now have shown that there are barriers, and there are tiered barriers to achieving transplantation. One key study from our colleagues at the School of Public Health, Arnie Epstein and others, looked at how you get to transplant. There are steps that you have to, milestones that you have to execute and achieve. So first you have to get referred, and then after referral you have to get evaluated, and then after your evaluation you have to get placed on the waiting list for the transplant, the National Kidney waiting list, and then you have the opportunity for forced transplant. They showed in their studies, and this was a seminal study in 2000, which was in fact published in the New England Journal, that in the first instance, getting referred, there's about an 8% difference between white individuals as compared to blacks who are on the wait list. And then those patients who went on to get evaluated, there was about a 15% disparity between the two groups. And then realizing first transplantation of the kidney, there was a deep disparity, a 35% difference, whites over and above blacks who received that opportunity. And again, we know that kidney transplantation is the best practice, the most efficient way of restoring full renal health. And so those disparities have to be intentionally addressed at each level, and providers have to be cognizant, systems have to be cognizant that they need to do the work of intervening at each potential hurdle to get folks beyond those barriers. And those barriers are clear-cut, they've been defined, and they are impediments to equal access to a scarce resource, which in this country, a kidney transplant happens to be.
It's just so important to recognize that. So there are two more questions. I'm going to give a little personal context to go with each of the questions that are coming in because they're really great. And then we'll make sure to bring out Joe next. So this first question is about navigation. Let me just give a little bit of context. We and others have found, looking in telemedicine, digital health, just like you pointed out, Dr. Williams, those with heart failure were less likely in the cardiovascular world to engage with telemedicine. Those who are of African American or Black American origin were also less likely, and then it compounds together. And there are many groups, including Kumar Brown, one of our fellows, who's working very hard at trying to start some digital navigation programs, trying to really have people who look like their patients, who can help speak to them, who can bring some trust to the process. Is that potentially an avenue in research recruitment as well? Or do we get into trouble with coercing people to participate in research? How do you do that? The question here is about, is there a role for navigators in research?
It's a great question. And in fact, that's a part of the intentional, I think, strategy that I've been referring to. So at Johns Hopkins, at the University of New Mexico, at UNC, there are researchers that are tackling this very problem, and that is to bring, for example, transplant services out to the community that are patient-centered, that there are stakeholder-engaged strategies to address disparities in access and social support for transplantation, engaging patients, families, faith leaders, and community members. And this is a partnership between academic medical centers and trusted agents in these vulnerable communities, and represent, again, across the country in these key pilot studies, novel, I think, academic community partnerships to promote health equity. And so I do believe that this is a fertile area for investigation, because these kinds of trials make a difference in terms of identifying how you can move beyond those various hurdles that I pointed out.
That's impressive to know.
This story and discussion is just so important. And I think Dr. Williams and I have talked about this before because he trained me, made me the wonderful nephrologist that I am. So I grew up in Mississippi, and I was actually one of the early researchers in the Jackson Heart Study. And what was profound to me was this ability for us as an academic community, as clinicians, to communicate, to educate, to engage the community around us. And Dr. Williams, you alluded to it, the distrust that the system has in our history is just so profound. And I'm going to tell a story to say I did not realize how profound it was. My parents grew up in the 1960s of Mississippi. They were at school at Ole Miss when there was the forced JFK integration. And this history, I think, is still with us. I went to school at the University of Mississippi. We had a free clinic that was called the Jackson Free Clinic. We opened up every Saturday for 6 hours, free flu shots, free blood pressure checks, free basic labs. I came in and we had no patients. We had dropped a clinic in a predominantly African American community, and I just don't know what happened. We had 6 doctors, 5 med students chatting there, and maybe we'd have 1 or 2 patients. We just were not able, this was 20 years ago, so maybe it's changed, but we were not able to say, hey, let me go into the community. Let me build trust. Let me have this conversation with you. So my big initiative was actually just walking around the community, meeting people, learning who they are, learning what they wanted. And once you start to engage, then you have the community leaders start bringing you in. So then the preachers were like, oh, I had no idea that this existed. Let me have you come talk to my congregation. I had one preacher who had a public radio network, and he had me on his public radio. And then we actually had it carried by the Clarion Ledger, the newspaper. But and it took like months. It took like 6 to 12 months to move the needle. People were excited when we had 2 patients come in, and then like if we got to a full day of like, okay, now the med students have something to do. But the profoundness of our inability to communicate with the surrounding community, I think we've seen that with the pandemic too.
Mhm.
How can we do, and Dr. Bhatt, your husband knows this well as a public health leader. How can we do a better job? And is it simple things like the navigator reaching out to the community? How do we bring the community up together? Sorry, I just had a...
No, I think that's a great story. And let me tell you, Jennifer, we're kindred spirits because I was born and raised in Louisiana. So I understand your experience, although I think yours probably is a bit different than mine. But, what you said about going out into the community as a medical student, as a student in Mississippi, folks there then realize that that's a person who's authentic and who really wants to become a part of our community and part of the solution to big problems. And that is goes a long way to solidifying and winning trust. And the other thing I would say is that, growing up as you did in the Deep South in Mississippi, I would celebrate your parents because they had challenges. I know that because my parents had challenges. Civil rights were topics around our table at almost every dinner, and education was a ticket out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still with us. Yeah.
Yep. And it's still the ticket out, and that's true globally. It's true everywhere. Education is the ticket out. I see Joe is nodding vigorously backstage. I'm sorry, Joe, we got caught up there. Let's bring you out. So next we have the head of Marketing Insights and Analytics at JMIR, Joe Pold, brings editorial experience from his time at Springer Nature first, then at Wiley, to bear on problem solving and growing the educational and academic portfolio through traditional but also novel means. He's been really instrumental in thinking about open access and giving everybody a chance to publish, and that's been incredibly important in terms of diversity and inclusion. So why don't we bring on Joe to join us as well?
Thanks, guys. Hey, I gotta say it's the biggest round of applause I've ever gotten in my life, fake or otherwise. It's really interesting. I was having a really good time sitting backstage, hearing about you guys talking about your kind of personal experiences and sort of the front end of the research, and how can we get people, DEI involved more in sort of the front end of the research. So I'm really interested. My personal background is all about kind of open access, and I'll rattle on about how I'm a champion for that ad nauseum. But I was really interested specifically in what Dr. Williams was talking around, sort of the new supplement that the New England Journal is looking to implement on all submissions, right? Like from my perspective, that is open science, right? Like that's a move towards open science. That's definitely a move in the right direction. And I sort of I've got a couple of questions for you folks who are researchers. It's always my favorite thing to be around talking to scientists about their work and the things that matter most to them. But I think sort of for your audience, perhaps if I gave a little sort of review of what open science is and what sort of open access either kind of means to me might be kind of helpful. So, I work for JMIR Publications. We're a fully open access publisher. We're older than PLOS. I'll happily plug that. We've been open access since 1999. Back when our CEO Gunther decided that he looked around and said, computers might have a future in medicine. And a lot of people said, nah, that's silly. We like having our notes on paper. And here we are. It's all different now. So, the open access mission is all about the open science mission. The open access mission is part of sort of the broader open science mission. Open science means transparency from start to finish, whether that's, here is the cohort that we analyzed and the information around them. We're going to publish that data so that all of the data that we used in our research is available to our peers to look at and review to make sure that we're getting the best feedback, and we're presenting the clearest picture of the research that we've conducted. So that means, in recent years, we've seen an explosion in things like publishing of preprints. This version of your manuscript that you submit to the journal, but before it's been typeset and approved, sort of the green OA, and what it's called. It means sort of open peer review. So, the traditional, overwhelmingly, publishing is still conducted with either single or double-blind peer reviews. Dr. Williams submits a paper, doesn't know who isn't reviewing it. That person, and that kind of comes, all of these things around the blind and the open peer review are kind of double-edged swords and sort of promote different behaviors. But it's sort of that entire package as a whole that creates open science. So I can look at your results, I can look at your methods, all of the information around your research is published and accessible, right? Like it's not just I have this supplementary table that explains who and why I did this research on. It's the fact that I can access, I as a member of the lay public can access it. It's not behind a paywall. And I think that has the benefits specifically for clinical research are kind of myriad, but a couple, sort of kind of fun anecdotal ones are, if you want people to feel empowered as patients, part of our sort of portfolio at JMIR as well as participatory medicine, which I'm sure you guys have probably discussed before in the show. So sort of what we want to do, right, is like that information being available to someone who participated in that trial is a really empowering thing, right? It sort of connects the process of science to the individual. It says like, well, someone called me on a Thursday and asked me a bunch of questions about the medications I take and my diet. And I don't know, it felt kind of abstract on the Thursday, but now I've seen this paper, this piece is published. I can see the data, myself as kind of a data point and how sort of I can contribute to science as part of a larger data set. So I think there's a lot of value around getting sort of the public engaged there, and to the sort of discussion you're having before I joined around how can we get people of color into these studies so that we can get better results, better clinical results for them. I think that is a really good first step, is just saying like this you can be a part of science and being very clear that you participating in this does have actual results, can actually lead to interventions, and really supporting people and helping them understand that. Another thing as well is the sort of key cornerstone point, perhaps, of identity in peer review week, which is the theme of this year's peer review week, is around, the big scare is retaliation. So the classic defense of I like blind or double-blinded publications is it means, if I'm starting my career, I decide to go to med school, big change in life, but hey, things can happen. And, Ami or Winfred, submit a paper to my journal, I can say, well, I actually think that they may have missed these things. There's some oversights here. And I can say this with confidence, not knowing that one day, if I'm up for promotion, Ami's not going to be like, it's that one guy that consulted my research and I'm going to hold that against him forever. So that's the sort of like the classical kind of defense of why we do sort of blinded and double-blinded peer reviews. But I think that works if people know how to give really good peer reviews, right? Because a lot of people use that as a shield, and I'm sure I would love to. It's always fun to hear the anecdotal stories, because I'm sure Ami and I'm sure when you've gotten some feedback that has been less than constructive, I think we can say, and it's just like, what do I do with this? It just kind of sours the mood. It's not good science. It's not helpful, and people hide behind that. And so, to bring it back to sort of the DEI point, part of what we like to do is, particularly with at JMIR, we really encourage open peer review. So if you conduct a review on a manuscript that ends up getting published, we allow you, and it's really strongly encourage you to allow your name to be presented alongside the published pieces. I am attaching my name. These are my thoughts. I stand for this science as well. I think that's a very powerful statement. But to sort of the DEI piece, I think that the other side of having an open peer review and understanding who the reviewer pool is is really helpful for, particularly young researchers, and whether that be of historically marginalized groups, whether that be women or people of color. They can go and say, it's an incredible achievement that Dr. Williams is the first person of color to be, on the decision-making board of the New England Journal of Medicine. And I think that sends a really strong message if someone, if you know who those reviewers are and you're a researcher and you say, I can submit my work that, looks at a population, the Black population in the Deep South and their relationship to like renal care. They can say, I can understand, I see Dr. Williams on that board and I understand that he understands my perspective in that, if I'm writing from that position, I will understand my research will be given a fair shake. Yeah. And I think that's just a real kind of benefit, sort of the overview of the benefits of open peer review and kind of open science.
That's perfect, Joe. And I think really the word transparency is so important for all of these relationships, whether it's for the patients trusting that they understand how the science was done and it's available to them. I think whether it's younger people who are writing papers and submitting them and really wanting to understand who's looking at my paper and are there potential mentors out there who could help me and who's doing this process. And so I think just as we say, it's important for our patients to see people who look like us take care of us as our caregivers. It's equally important in the academic arena for everybody to see themselves in all of these different roles that are so essential in making the kind of diverse population feel at home in academia. And I think that's key. One of the questions that came up previously, I'm going to change the orientation a little bit, and I'll pose this to both of you. So the question is about genetics. Let me give some perspective. Dr. Williams, some of your previous research has looked at not only the disproportion of kidney disease in the Black population, but also some of the genetics and apolipoproteins that may lead to that. In the South Asian population, we see something very similar. 25% of the world's population is South Asian, but 60% of the world's cardiovascular disease burden lays with that 25%. And it's worse disease. It's more likely to require a coronary artery bypass. We are less likely to be offered a coronary artery bypass. It's just such a similar story to the renal transplant story. And we have lipoprotein little a, which is, again, a genetic marker that we're looking for. And so when you are both looking to kind of move forward and publish research, do we think that so the question is about genetics. When we do that, are we actually furthering the cause of research by publishing that there are genetic bases for some of these differences? And does that affect how we treat the social determinants of health that have led to perhaps the same or even an increased risk of those diseases? Does that make sense? Am I saying the sentence correctly?
No, I think it does make sense. So there's a great debate. There's a great tension between environment and, as you know, and genetics. So nurture and nature. My view is that both are really quite important to probe and not necessarily stigmatize. And so some folks feel that genetic studies have the real potential to stigmatize populations. But if you, as you alluded to, the ApoL1 genetic variation at the gene locus ApoL1, apolipoprotein 1, does confer, for example, higher risk of CKD and progression to end-stage renal disease to a large cohort of African-American population in the United States. And the way, just very quickly, the way that variant rose, variation at that gene locus, G1 and G2, rose in natural selection to high frequency in sub-Saharan Africa some 30 to 40,000 years ago, when those populations were subject to African sleeping sickness, trypanosomiasis. And if you had a genetic variation at that locus, G1 or G2, your serum was lytic for trypanosomes, and that was protective. Unfortunately, though, that also confers a risk for kidney disease. And 400 years ago, in the slave migration from the sub-Saharan West Africa to the United States, African Americans carried along that genetic signature. So some 10 to 13, 14% of African Americans have those gene variants. And if you're heterozygous, compound heterozygote, or homozygous for those mutations, G1 and G2, you have that conferred risk for kidney insufficiency. That's an important area to study. Why is that operant in Black folks? What is the mechanism by which this genetic variation leads to kidney disease? But you can't ignore social determinants of health that have a great impact as well. And I think the two have to go forward in parallel.
Right. Right. I think that makes complete sense. Jen, do you have something coming through there on your end?
No, it's such a great discussion, but I am just getting nervous about our time.
We can go all day.
I was one of the early publishers on this. I was like, oh, because of the Jackson Heart study.
Time does go a little too quickly. So maybe you're right. I'm now looking down as well. I was just fully engaged in conversation. Maybe we can start. Oh, this was too short, you guys. We're going to have to do this again.
Yeah, we're going to
start
do it again.
Joe, with a couple kind of final words about your thoughts
Not a
on.
Couple. Sorry.
Sorry.
10 seconds or
okay.
less.
10 seconds. Moving forward, what can our audience do to support open science? Go.
What they can do to support open science, I would strongly encourage you to, I'll go through the basics. Make sure you have your ORCID ID. Make sure you're getting recognized for the reviews you do on services like Publons. It's you guys, I'm sure all the academics are already keeping track of the number of reviews you get. Boom, just put them in one place with Publons. Don't have to look at it at the end of the year. And, I would say, if I may pivot just 1 second to answer sort of like the second half of the question Dr. Williams was just answering, I think it's very interesting, like to those studies I think are very important, should be done. I think all avenues of exploration are valid. But I think that's where the context of who's looking at that paper, right? Like I think that's where it becomes all the more important for someone who has that experience, who's got that lived experience, to be looking at that paper. And that's where sort of the work on the publisher side comes in. Like, it's not a secret to say that editorial boards are not representative of the authorships that they, supposedly serve. So I think that is a really excellent example of why bringing sort of people, with different experiences and backgrounds into it is important, because it makes that research not as taboo, and it makes it much more understood and better understood by the people who, are conducting it and who will most affect. So anyway, that was kind of a tangent on that, but
no, that's perfect, Joe.
I would just say, if I could just add in this one comment, that, the idea of including ethnic minority populations in the clinical trials and cohort studies sustains the generalizability of findings to the population as a whole. The whole point of investigative medicine. And I think more generally, ethnic minority exclusion from clinical trials undermines the broad goals of eliminating healthcare disparities in our healthcare system. And so they're just big principles that have to be adhered to. And I would say, going forward, in terms of really sort of achieving the objectives, I think we should want to work with funders and researchers, and frankly, open access and other journals to appropriately diversify trial participation. I think they're important goals.
And I think with that, can't really say anything more. That was wonderful. Dr. Williams, Joe, Dr. Joe, thank you all so much for a great discussion. Thank you to our audience for starting a little early with us. And we really look forward to seeing everybody. Please feel free to continue this conversation online. Jen and I will get back online after we give our presentation at 1:15 and try and answer some more questions and connect you with both Dr. Williams and Joe if you'd like to be connected.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed this.
Thank you to our audience, and we'll see everyone next Tuesday at 12 noon.